Welcome to Junkyard Theory, folks. And tonight's guest is none other than the man behind Toy Story. He was the producer on Toy Story and co-founder of Pixar, Mr. Ralph Guggenheim. Ralph, thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Ayubowan, Sri Lanka. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on board, Ralph. It's been quite a while since we started Junkyard Theory, but we've never really had anybody who's done pretty much like animated movies. And when I reached out to you, I was like, all right, I'm gonna get the man who started the whole animation frenzy back in 1995, at least the producer. So Toy Story kind of kicked off a whole lot of change for the industry itself. Yes. I'm curious as to know, like, how did you get into the industry, like way back when?
I got into it through a series of very happy accidents, is probably the best way to say it. You know, some people plan out their careers and have a path of where they are today and where they're going to get. My story is a very bit different. Although I was always focused on something related to filmmaking, I really had no idea that would lead me into animation per se. I had the happy accident in high school of making some films with friends after school. This was way back when there was no easy portable video. Everything that, if you were a filmmaker, you shot film. And a friend of mine had a 16 millimeter camera that his uncle had loaned him. And so we would go out after school and make some very silly films. When I got to university, they asked me what I wanted to major in, and I really was not interested. I was interested in what we call liberal arts here in the States. But in fact, I was not interested in becoming a literature major. So I suggested I become a film major. And since that sounded like something fun to do. And they said, well, we have no film department here. This is at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they said, but you can write your own major and create your own curriculum. So I said, great, I'll do that. And again, another happy accident. I happened to encounter I did some reading and learned about something new called computer animation. And I thought to myself, here I am on a university that's known for its technical and computer departments. I bet there must be somebody here who's interested in this sort of thing. And so I started hunting around, and I came across a professor who had just recently joined the university, Dr. Raj Reddy. And although his primary interest was in artificial intelligence, he was very interested in graphics and that sort of thing. So he sort of allowed me to fool around with the computers in his department, and one thing led to another. And I started making films for him on research topics that they were investigating. And I'd illustrate these films with little bits of what we would call computer animation back in the mid-1970s, and which is basically line-drawn animation. And then I decided to go get a graduate degree in that same area, continued making films. And after that was done, I heard about a place in New York at the New York Institute of Technology that was making computer animation. And I went there, got a job, and shortly after that, a bunch of us were hired away about 2 years later, in 1980, to work for Lucasfilm, who was starting a computer research group. And there I was in charge of building, I was a software engineer basically in those days, and filmmaker, because one had to be both if you wanted to make animation on a computer. So I went to work at Lucasfilm in charge of the group that was building a system for video editing of motion pictures. And after I did that for 5 years, and we released it as a commercial product called Edit Droid, because everything in the Lucasfilm world has a droid associated with it. After we released Edit Droid, I really wanted to get back to filmmaking and not so much software development. And I joined the group that was doing animation that would soon be spun off and form Pixar in 1986. And we started by doing short films, many of which are well known today, like Luxo Jr. and Tin Toy, which won an Academy Award. Directed by John Lasseter. You could say I'm the man behind Toy Story, but I'm the producer behind Toy Story. The director and the creative spirit behind Toy Story is Mr. Lasseter. And he had been an animator at Disney, and they very much wanted him back. But he had left Disney because at the time that he was there, they were not interested in computer animation. By 1990, when we had won an Academy Award for Tin Toy, they were very interested in computer animation. And they tried to hire John away from us, but he insisted that really they would need a team around him like we had at Pixar. So they agreed, let's make the film at Pixar. So we started working on that in 1990 and 91, and it took 4 years to see it to fruition. But it was an exciting time, and it was, from the time that I went to work I should say, from the time I was at university and I saw my first computer-generated images, I was awestruck with the power of what computers could do for imagery. And I was very interested in creating animated sequences and seeing what I could do myself. When I went to New York, I was surrounded for the first time by other people who had the same vision and who felt that maybe in about 10 years, we would make the first computer animated feature-length movie. Well, that was in 1978. And we were off by about 10 years. So not a surprise. A lot of things had to happen for this to be possible. And one of them was that, of course, if you would think about what makes it possible to make a film of that scope, you would say, well, the computers have to be inexpensive enough that they're affordable for the budget. And that's very true. But the other thing that is essential is that you needed trained artists who would know how to work in this medium. And there were none in those days. John Lasseter and a few others you could probably count on your both hands how many computer animators there were in the world. So a big challenge for us was bringing the level of artistry up to where we had technical people and animators who were comfortable with this medium. And that took us the other 10 years beyond our first estimate. So we spun off and formed Pixar in 1986 from Lucasfilm, really as a hardware company. But the team I was working with had been making short films already for several years. And we were continuing to improve not just our software base, but also our skills. We were starting to bring in other people. When I started, we were a team of about 5 people. By the time we were negotiating with Disney, we were doing television commercial work. We're up to about 25 people. And at that point, we only needed to hire another 100 people to make Toy Story. And so if each person could teach 4 people what they do, 4 or 5 people what they do, it'd be easy, we thought. And of course, nothing is ever as easy as you think it's going to be when you dive into it. But we found a lot of great animators who had never worked with computers. And we found technical people who had computer graphics training. And we put those teams together. And that's, in many respects, the secret sauce of Pixar is twofold. First of all, the ability to tell great stories and to focus everything on storytelling. And the second thing is to bring people together who are both technical and artistic. They're both creative, but one has a more technical orientation, the other one more artistic, and help them to really work together so that they challenge each other and they keep pushing each other to do better and better. And that's, that in the service of great storytelling is what makes Pixar work.
That's amazing. And when it comes to, this particular film, Toy Story, like you guys were innovating, like creating something that had not been done before, an entire animated feature film. So what do you think are the key components that kind of led to this point? Like you mentioned, you need animators and then people who are, capable with the whole artistic side of things as well as the technical side of things.
Right.
But to get to to do what Toy Story did for storytelling, like what were those key components?
Right. There were quite a few. I mean, one of them, as I mentioned, the two critical ones were getting the costs to where they were affordable. Mm-hmm. And we're talking 1990. So, a PC that was capable of rendering 3D computer graphics did not exist in those days. One had to buy workstations that sat next to your desk that were $30,000-$40,000, US dollars a piece, along with building a farm to do all the rendering. I'll put it in perspective. We were thrilled that our render farm had a disk server that stored 1 terabyte of data. Today, you can buy 1 terabyte for your laptop for about $25, right? 1 terabyte storage system in those days was, I forget how many, tens of thousands of dollars. So this was not something you could do like you do today through laptops and with GPUs that didn't exist at the time. So certainly the costs had to come down just of the hardware, but 3/4 of the cost of making one of these films is people, is the labor, is the creative talent behind it all. And that was where we needed to really bring people in and train them. And ultimately we formed something called Pixar University to bring people in who were not experienced in computer animation, train them, and then we would choose the very best students and give them jobs at Pixar. And the students who were not the very best got jobs at other great computer animation studios and also went on to do great work. But we realized we had to bring up the field of animation. So what did we do? We found people, first of all, we understood, and John Lasseter was very helpful in this. We recognized that animators were great, not because they worked on computers, but because they understood the language of animation really well. They understood the language of pantomime. They understood how to pose characters, the importance of creating a silhouette that communicated well on screen. And we found many of those coming out of hand-drawn animation. Many of them, there was at the same time that we were starting Toy Story, The Nightmare Before Christmas was being made in San Francisco, directed by Henry Selick. And that was finishing up. So there were a number of stop motion animators who were becoming available, and they understood the frame by frame process of animation all too well. In fact, so well that we had to train them that they could really let the computer do in-betweening for them. They had a tendency to want to pose every frame instead of let the computer doing some of the work. But still, they understood the world of animation. And we found that within about 8 or 9 weeks, we could train animators who had traditional skills to use our software system and to start turning out footage for our film. So that was a big challenge for us, but something that that was one of the real constraints. The other thing was, there were, we'd look back and we say, oh, it was such a revolutionary film. But one has to realize that all we changed was the mechanism for making the images. We didn't change what it takes to make a great script. We didn't change, and arguably one could have made Toy Story with stop motion characters or with puppets. Right? Might not have been quite as interesting, but the story could have been told that way. So storytelling was still a requirement, and writing a script and doing storyboarding, as was done in animation for 100 years, we were not inventing anything new. From that point, after storyboarding through to printing images on film, that was the part that we were doing that was new. Once it was on film, taking it to the laboratory, having the color correction done, going and having sound design done, these were all well understood techniques at that time, and not very hard to we could find people who could do this. And of course, getting it out into movie theaters in those days where it was still shown on film was also something. There was a whole infrastructure, a whole industry built around that. So what did we innovate? We innovated the way we made the images and how we harnessed this technology to make images in a way that people had not seen before. That was the milestone of the work that we were doing.
Today, Pixar is known for their storytelling combined with amazing images at the same time.
Right.
Back when you guys were doing Toy Story, how many times did you go back to the drawing board because if you felt like the story was not working? How many times did you guys
Well, there's been a lot written about the trials and tribulations that we went through on that film. Part of which was that we had gone and so when Disney was interested in us in making the film, their first notion was that we would all move to Los Angeles. Once we were 400 miles away in San Francisco. Once we corrected that notion, we then started talking with them about ideas for films. And they said, well, we have a whole bunch of scripts that we would love to see made that we have sitting on a shelf. And we said, no, we're not interested in working with your scripts. John Lasseter and his team are strong storytellers. And they said, fine, come down and pitch us an idea. So we came down, we pitched 2 ideas to Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the head of animation at the time. One of which was a film about 2 toys who meet and don't get along, essentially what we call a genre, we call a buddy picture. And the other one was based on a book that we liked very much by William Joyce, a terrific storyteller and children's book illustrator, who went on to make films with Blue Sky, actually, later on. And it turns out that Jeffrey Katzenberg had worked at Paramount Pictures when they made 48 Hours with Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte. And he loved buddy pictures. 48 Hours is a buddy picture. So we never even got around to talking about our second idea. We pitched the first idea. He loved it. And the next thing we had to do was to go make a test of about 30 seconds long to show what could be done. In that test, we put everything that computer animation could do that you could never do in hand-drawn animation. We put a plaid shirt on Woody. We had a reflective helmet on what was then a guy called Lunar Larry. He wasn't even Buzz Lightyear at the time. We had light coming through Venetian blinds that created those stripe effects over people's faces as they moved, and you could see the shadows and the light playing with each other. Impossible to do with hand-drawn animation. And we said, this is sort of like the baseline of what we can do in these 30 seconds of what the film might look like. The people at Disney were thrilled, and they kept showing it over and over to their animators, and their animators were drooling at the opportunity that this presented. So that went well. And then we started on the process of writing the script and the story based on the pitch that we had done for Jeffrey Katzenberg. And then Disney started coming in and giving us story notes. And they kept asking us to make the characters more edgy and more sarcastic and more sardonic. And we were new in this world of making feature-length films, you know, and although we had strong ideas, we listened to the people at Disney and we did what they asked for. And increasingly, as we went down and visited to show progress on the story and on animation, not on animation, on story reels, where we would put the storyboard drawings on video and with some character voices. They kept telling us, no, we don't like where the characters are going. Push them harder, make them more edgy, make them, until finally you hated these characters. You hated Buzz, you hated Woody. And Disney said, you know, this is not going well, so we may have to stop this project. We'll give you 4 months to fix this story problem. We had already started producing animation at that point. And so we were very close to never getting the film made. To the credit of John and his team, they sat in an office for a couple of months nonstop. They barely went home, and they rewrote the whole script. And they made it the story that they wanted to tell, not the story that Disney was asking us to tell. It was closer to the original story that we proposed. We put that up on story reels. We took it back to Disney, and they said, "Oh, now you guys understand what we wanted." It's like not at all what they wanted, you know. But in fact, it saved the whole project, and we were able to continue from there. We were in the process of animating what we considered to be a first good scene to show the studio, and that was the scene where the Green Army men parachute down into the birthday party. Fortunately, our story changes didn't affect that scene very much. And so we were able to continue making that scene. And we felt one of the nice things about that scene is we needed the set of the boys' house. We needed some plants and things downstairs that they would hide in. But otherwise, all the Green Army men were basically the same model in different poses. So we built one model and we could create a whole scene. And we didn't have to do Buzz or Woody. We could just do the Green Army men. And yet show again how great the film could look in that way. And so that's what we did. And then we were able to pick up. So it was really, this was by November of 1992 that we ran into this impasse. And around April of 93, we got the go-ahead and we got the approval to go ahead and make the rest of the film. And it was very tough because for 6 months or so, fortunately we had a TV commercial group that was still working. And so we didn't want to lose these animators who we had just educated and trained, and they were starting to produce animation, or our technical team. So we put them over onto doing TV commercials as much as they could and kept everybody because Disney was not going to pay their salaries until we got the story fixed. So we had to be very inventive and come up with ways to keep this core team that we had spent a lot of time bringing up to speed. But that worked out, and that was one of the big problems. That was the biggest problem we faced. The other problems we faced were simply that we were defining within that little area that we were working of from the story to printing it out on film. We were constantly reinventing how we worked. We had done this before for television commercials and short films, but we had never done anything of the scale of making a 75-minute movie. And so it took a lot of thinking and rethinking and setting up. We never set up departments to specialize on certain things because we had 8 people working on a short film. You didn't need departments. Now we had 120 people. So we had to, as a producer, we had to, and I produced the film with Bonnie Arnold. I wasn't producing by myself. We had to really rethink every department. And it was sort of like building a factory that could produce something on a conveyor belt, if you want to think of it that way. And then every time we started at the beginning of the conveyor belt, we'd work department by department to the end. And by the time we got to the end, we realized, oh no, we have a problem at the beginning and we have to start all over again and keep fixing the process and tuning the process by which we did this, because we had never done this before. And we had a lot of help from the people at Disney who, even though they were working in hand-drawn animation, dealt with many of the logistics that we deal with, but still it was very different.
So when it came to the producing part, you and Bonnie, how did you guys like collaborate together and essentially problem solve when it came to this project? Like you said, you go through the conveyor belt and realize like there are problems from before. So as a producer, how did you tackle those?
Well, so Disney. I had never made a feature-length computer animated film before, right? Or feature film, any
no one
film
had
before. No one had, but any film before. Bonnie had never worked in animation before, but she had worked on features for big studios. And so Disney suggested, after they talked to a few people, they suggested Bonnie might be a good match. We met, we liked each other, and she came to work with us. She brought the Hollywood mindset of how to work with studios and how to work with that industry. I brought the years of experience I had because I'd been a software engineer, because I'd made animation myself. I was never as good an animator as the animators I worked with, nor I was as good a coder as the coders I worked with. But I understood the tasks that they had to do very well. And having made a number of short films together and TV commercials, I knew the business side and I knew where the flexibilities were in the process. And then we would sit down with each, now we had departments of people, and work with them and with their managers in each department to figure out the schedule and the process by which they do it. And then as they ran into problems, we just worked through the problems. I can't tell you that it's any more complicated than, in some degrees, common sense. And I would have to say in some areas, our tools might not have been robust enough to tackle some problems. And so simply by brute force, we just pushed our way through. As we approached the end of the film, and we had a major deadline approaching of the film being in theaters, our lighting team brought sleeping bags to work, and they slept under their desks for weeks on end, and they lit every shot in that movie to get it done, because that was the only way it could really get done. We gave them lots of incentives, and we started bringing in bushel loads of food, so nobody had to leave the building. They could have dinner, they could have lunch, anything they wanted. But it was just hard work. And people tend to think of computer animation as something where the computers really do the work. We have to correct that image, because it's the computer is just a better pencil than we had before. It still takes tremendous amounts of human creativity to get these films made.
100%. So live action versus animation. There are certain limitations that you can do with live action, and then you can push the boundaries with animation movies. So how do you think, since Toy Story came out, how has that I guess the benchmark
even at the time? So we knew a lot of people at Lucasfilm and at Industrial Light and Magic. They're a visual effects company. In 1990, they had just finished work on Jurassic Park, the first Jurassic Park, and that was when we announced that we were going to make a feature-length computer animated film. And we'd run into our friends at Industrial Light and Magic, and they'd say, "You guys are crazy. We just finished 25 minutes of visual effects shots for Jurassic Park, and it almost killed us. How are you going to make a 75-minute film? Impossible." But what we knew was that it wasn't, in a film like Jurassic Park, your visual effects have to match reality.
Yeah.
Those dinosaurs have to look like they really are existing in our world. In animation, we're building the world from scratch. There is no Pizza Planet. There is no Andy's house. None of these places exist. And so everything is built from nothing, and it's all built to look somewhat real, but it's not real. And the biggest compliment we got in Toy Story was that by the time you got to the chase at the end of the movie, the big chase scene where they're chasing the moving van.
Yeah.
People would say to us, that town that they're racing through looks so realistic. And we would say to them, it doesn't look realistic. If you looked at any individual frame, you would see how unrealistic it is. But you've been living with this world for 70 minutes by the time you get to the scene, and this has become your reality. And so now it looks realistic because
You've essentially transported them into that world.
Well, there's an expression that when you watch a film, you suspend disbelief. That was the word I was looking for. And you have to suspended disbelief enough that you believe this is a real world. And that's a credit to what we had done. We were very proud of that, So, there's that. Now, of course, in computer animation, there were things that the story artists would suggest that our technical team would just roll their eyes and say, this is impossible to do. Things like there was going to be a scene in the film where, and it still sort of exists, where Andy's little brother, who's a baby, was going to take a bowl of cereal and drop it on his face or stick Woody in it. And you'd see all the milk and the cereal rolling down his face. And the technical people said, we cannot do that with fluids. We just don't have the technical, that problem has not been solved yet. Today, that problem has been solved many times over. And there's really, I can't say nothing, but there's hardly anything that one can imagine today that cannot be done in computer imagery. So we come back to the core problem, which is if everybody has the tools to make great images, what's the thing that makes one group better than the other? It's the story they're telling. The storytelling always comes back to being the core element of what makes these films work.
So somebody went back and analyzed Pixar movies, I think up until 2008, and figured out all right, these guys have an X number of rules that they kind of follow. Did you guys intentionally come up with that, or
rules in what sense?
That you guys use to develop stories? But I mean, from a filmmaker's point of view, these have existed for as long as storytelling has existed.
Yeah, but exactly. We actually, at the beginning, there's a fellow named Bob McKee, and Bob McKee has a book called, today he has a book called Story. That's very well known in the storytelling world. But he also travels around the world and he gives, I don't know if he still does it, but he would give a 3-day, he gives a 3-day seminar on storytelling. And we decided that one area that we were not experienced in was that level of expertise in storytelling. And so about 25 of us over a period of months would go take his seminar. And what it gave us was a common language that we could work with. So they weren't rules, but we understood the common language of how to tell a 3-act story. And anybody who wants to be a filmmaker, I highly recommend you study either Bob McKee or other people who teach this sort of thing. Because if you don't understand the basics of storytelling, and even telling a 3-act story, I mean, look, most of the films, I would say 99% of the films we see follow 3-act story structure. There are a few unusual directors and filmmakers who can go beyond that, very few. And even Bob McKee says that. There are very few who really can break with 3-act story. 3-act story structure is complicated enough. And to be able to go beyond that is a real trick. We had to learn that language. And so rather than rules, we just needed to know the language. We have to understand what does it mean to have the inciting incident in a story? What does it mean to have the 3rd-act reversal that happens in so many films we see? In Toy Story, the 3rd-act reversal is when Woody lights the match that's going to ignite the rocket, and then the match gets blown out, right? It's like, oh, he almost made it. Oh, no, he didn't.
Yeah.
And so many films have that, of course. But to understand these structural mechanisms that help stories work, that people recognize in storytelling, whether they recognize it consciously or unconsciously, audiences adhere to 3-act story structure, which goes back to Aristotle, who first described this in Greece 2,000 years ago. So we had to understand that. Beyond that, there weren't very many rules except the rules of our story and the world of our story. And every animated film has a world, and there are rules in that world. If you watch a Roadrunner cartoon, the rules of gravity don't apply. When you run off a cliff, you can spin your legs in midair for quite some time before you drop. Right? That would not work in the world of Toy Story. Okay, the world of Toy Story has physics that resemble the real world in some degree. But there were also rules in Toy Story, such as, generally speaking, when people are around, toys don't move. Right? That was a rule. And so, of course, then we break that rule very significantly at the end of the film when the toys come alive in front of Sid, the kid next door. Yeah. So, and so that was a significant reason to break that rule because it helped the story. But those are the kind of rules we worked with. As far as the thing that worried us the most at the time, particularly when we were doing that scene with the Green Army Men, was we were at the beginning of a 3-year process of making this film. And we knew that we would get better and better at making imagery as we got along. And our concern was, would that first scene look very primitive by the time we got to the rest of the scenes at the end of the movie? Fortunately, we were able to keep a consistent visual style. The only other rule that we applied very loosely was we wanted to make sure that the imagery in this film looked as good as it possibly could, so that other people trying to make films like this would have a very high threshold, a very high bar that they would have to cross to make a film as good or better than what we were doing. So that meant paying a lot of attention to, when you see the soldiers walking around the house, you see the scratches in the floor and on the walls, and things look very like people really live in this house. They don't look pristine.
Exactly.
And things like that. But beyond that, no, we didn't apply a lot of rules besides the rules that people already knew in filmmaking.
Fantastic. And you also shifted from, you worked at Pixar and then you went to EA, Electronic Arts.
Yes.
And work in video games. So storytelling and filmmaking versus video games, although it,
Right. Well, I went to EA. I went to EA because, in part, 1995 is when Toy Story came out. To give you perspective, 1995 was also the year that a company called Netscape went public on the stock market, because they had the first commercial web browser, this whole new thing. So 1995 was also the year that launched the internet. And I worked at Pixar till 1997. I thought, there's got to be some interesting opportunities for storytelling on the internet. And a friend of mine introduced me to people at EA, and we started talking. And they were very interested and actually had a project going on at that time that involved storytelling in the form of, let's call it like a TV series as a video game. And that project was called Majestic. And the idea was using all the tools of the internet to tell stories. And so the idea of Majestic was very interesting. And the idea was created by a fellow named Neil Young, who had been working in video games for many years. And Neil's idea was that on the internet, you have the ability to stream video, you have the ability to send email and text messages, you have the ability to create websites. What if you could use all those mechanisms to help tell a story? And so we created a storyline that was going to be a monthly, you would subscribe to a monthly episode after episode of this story. And it was about video gamers who had been building a game about government conspiracies, in particular around the Roswell incident and the presence of aliens in the United States. And there was actually historically a group called the Majestic Committee, I believe they're called, that the government founded to explore and investigate what was going on. And we were creating a story so you would sign up for this game. And the thing about this game is you would sign up and nothing would happen. So you would register, you would download a little bit of software, you'd install on your computer, and then that was it. And then 30 minutes later, you'd get an email from someone saying, hey, I think you should go take a look at this website over here. Something strange is happening at this video game company. And you go to the website, and there would be a video there of somebody saying, somebody blew up our building, we don't know what's going on. Do me a favor and call this phone number and use the voicemail system to there should be a message under Bob's voicemail, and his password is 123, and see what you can find there. And you dial into the voicemail, and you dial 123, and you'd hear Bob saying, there's a guy named Phil, and you can email him at this address, and he can give you more information. So you send the email, and 5 minutes later, you get an email back from Phil saying, or a text message from Phil saying, hey, I hear you're trying to reach me. What is it that you want? And so one thing after another would lead you down this storyline, but using these very different techniques of communication. And to me, that was quite fascinating. It was like, this is really what the internet could be all about.
Mm.
These became known as alternate reality games, ARGs. And there were a few others that came out around the same time. And unfortunately, I don't think they've really, I still don't follow today I don't follow the video game industry much, but I don't think there's much going on in that domain. And it's too bad. It's a really powerful storytelling medium. Unfortunately, so I went there in 2000, and we launched the game in July of 2001. And then September 11th, 2001 changed the world.
Yeah.
And the executives at EA felt that a game about government conspiracies was no longer very funny or amusing. And so unfortunately, the game had to be stopped. And although we had developed a technology base to do this sort of thing, there was no interest to come up with other games that might be, that might use the same idea. And so I worked at EA for another few months, but after I worked there for about 2 years, all told, 3 years, and I left. And because I was not interested in making the next golf game or the next soccer game. There were people who breathed and lived those games every day. They were terrific at what they did, but I was looking for things that were really storytelling opportunities, and that didn't seem to be in the cards there. So I left and ran into some old colleagues who were starting a small animation studio, and we formed Alligator Planet in 2003 to do a lot of work by outsourcing animation to studios around the world. And we would be the creative hub for that. And we had some good successes. We're still in business after 18 years, but we're much smaller than we used to be. We never had plans to be the next Pixar. In fact, the four of us who started that company had all worked at big animation studios, and we all wanted to do something small that we really could be much more hands-on with and be involved day to day in making animation, not just administering animation studios.
Are you guys still trying to push the boundaries of animation in any way, or
we're very small today? It's just myself and my partner Eli Noyes, and so the things that we do are because there's things that we can do. We're mostly in the 2D animation world, and we're mostly working on educational films or videos that are explainer videos, as you might call them.
Gotcha. Talk to me a little bit about. I want to go back to Pixar University. The one where you guys brought on people and educated them first, and then gave them jobs. What do you think about film education before you actually go out there and start making movies? What sort of importance do you guys place on this?
You're talking about general film education?
In general, filmmaking.
Yeah. Oh, it's huge. It's huge. There's no question that the people that we hired to make Toy Story were people who had traditional film skills, particularly the animators. And who knew storytelling from that point of view. Teaching them to use a computer, as I said, we could teach them in 8 or 9 weeks. So that wasn't hard. It was really looking for the traditional skills that they had. The technical artists were a little bit different. They were people who probably had experience with computer animation, or some of them came out of architecture, but had worked with architecture design software. Some of them came out of sculpting and other disciplines. But they all could be trained to use a computer, but they had art skills that were valuable before that. Yes. So yes, so to answer your question, yes, the most important thing is to have an education in storytelling, filmmaking, these sorts of things. I mean, if you look at Toy Story, there's no shots in Toy Story that are so revolutionary. We have some moving camera shots. We have some shots where we spiral down to see Buzz Lightyear lying on the floor when he's disappointed with how things are going. But if you analyze the film by shot, we were looking at everybody else's films at the same time, and we were screening films all the time for employees to look at, so that they got a sense. And people like Andrew Stanton, who became a director of Finding Nemo, and Wall-E, he would give talks on his favorite film directors and take you through the first 10 minutes of a film by David Lean and explain shot by shot what the director was doing and how effective this was at creating character, creating story, setting up the mood and the place where the story was taking place. And this was invaluable for people. We had a woman who was painting our textures for walls and baseboards and all these things, who came out of the San Francisco Opera, where she painted the sets. And we trained her to paint on the computer. So these were the kind of people we were looking for. And they brought a much deeper understanding because of the background they had in their field.
it's those transferable skills that they bring from something that's like, totally different from filmmaking, like traditional filmmaking, and like there's stuff that you can like kind of like bring into storytelling itself once you I guess teach them a common craft.
Yes, that's right. And as I say, some of them came out of areas that were not even related to filmmaking, but they were applicable to what we were doing. When we started working, I started working on Toy Story 2, and at the time we were looking for more artists of that nature, and so we started hiring people who were illustrators, and they were so grateful for their job, because what they told us was, ever since clip art became available on the web, their jobs were in jeopardy. The big corporate newsletters or quarterly reports and other things that would hire them as illustrators were no longer picking up their work. They were all using clip art and other things they could find easily on the internet, and so their jobs were in jeopardy. And here at least was a studio at Pixar that valued the skills they had and what they could bring to bear.
And as technology progresses, computers are becoming better, software is becoming better, all of that stuff. But
Absolutely.
Do you think something would at any point replace human creativity? I know it's a bit of a sci-fi kind of question.
In brief, the answer is no, but the world of AI is advancing all the time. And even while we were doing this film, people would constantly say to us, oh, well, then it won't be long before you're able to reanimate Marilyn Monroe, or that for some reason I always pick on Marilyn Monroe, or Humphrey Bogart. And it's like, and so the story we would tell them is this. There's a phenomenon in the US, you've probably seen it in various films, of people who like to dress up like Elvis Presley.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Elvis impersonators, they're called. And it's wonderful. They dress like Elvis. They move like Elvis. I've never met Elvis Presley. I doubt that you've ever met Elvis Presley, because you're even young. I was at least a kid when he was alive, but I never met Elvis Presley. I've seen films of Elvis Presley. I've seen examples of him singing, and yet I know when I look at one of these Elvis impersonators, they're not Elvis. Right? It is very difficult to really capture all the nuances of the human face and expression that go on. Now, we see examples in some of the more recent Star Wars films where they are trying to create footage of what's her name, who passed away?
Carrie Fisher.
Carrie Fisher, thank you. And try to create footage of her. And yet, I don't know about you, but when I see those scenes, there's something not quite right. There's something missing, And so I think, yes, I think at some point in time we'll have very reasonable facsimiles of people, but I don't know that they'll ever pick up all the nuance of the human character.
I think deep fake technology is kind of like pushing it a little bit on that edge, because the scene from The Mandalorian where Luke Skywalker unmasks himself, they've like a deep fake artist kind of like did a better job than Lucasfilm. So I think he got hired, and that goes to show like tech is kind of like improving. But
no, it's improving. It's improving. There's no question about it, and I'm sure it's a goal that people will aspire to.
Yeah.
But that's not, is that creativity?
Not really.
Is it storytelling creativity? I don't know. There are companies every once in a while I'll read about in Hollywood. Netflix was doing this for a while, who claimed, there was another company also, who claimed that they had an algorithm to you would feed in a movie script, and it would predict how much money the script would make at the box office. It's like that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because in fact, I was reading that there was a desire. Harrison Ford was not the first person that they cast for Indiana Jones, right? The fellow they were thinking of was the guy who plays Magnum PI. I can't think of the actor's name at the moment. Who's a very different kind of person, big burly guy, without who doesn't have the attitude that Harrison Ford brought to that part. So how could I feed in a Word file with a script for the film and know that if I add Harrison Ford or some other actor, whether this will make money at the box office? It's impossible to know. So this whole notion that we can algorithmically design stories and scripts, yes, we can, but are they good? That's a whole other question.
Because there's so much more that goes into, goes on top of the layers that form like the baseline of a script, right?
Well, I mean, like is there an algorithm that would come up with the scene in Toy Story where Buzz and Woody get dropped into the game with the little alien characters, and the aliens will go, "Oh, welcome to the West Mystic Portal." I mean, who writes that? That takes human ingenuity. I can't imagine an algorithm coming up with something as crazy as a scene like that.
True. That's very true.
Yeah, and it's those moments of unexpected discovery that make these kinds of films very interesting. Any film very interesting. If we're talking about Indiana Jones, it's a scene where, a guy pulls out he pulls out a whip and he's going to whip Indiana Jones, instead Indiana Jones pulls out a gun and shoots him.
The gun.
It's like, you never expected that. What, seemed just so strange. So, the human imagination still excels at doing this sort of thing.
Still reigns supreme.
Yeah.
Just to, I know we have like a very limited time,
Sure.
just to close things off. Any advice that you would give to anybody who's kind of like getting into filmmaking, and also looking at pushing the boundaries of storytelling, not necessarily through the tenets of storytelling, but through the medium itself?
Well, I mean, as we discussed, the first thing is really study filmmaking and really understand storytelling. Read as much as you can, watch as many films as you can, and watch them several times over. The first viewing is never, you're engrossed in the story itself, and you're not looking at the mechanics of the story. Watch it a second or a third time and start to understand how that story progresses, how it works, and how it moves along. And you'll see some incredible mistakes in stories, and you'll see some incredible successes as well. And they're both valuable to learn from. When I was at Pixar, we would talk endlessly about the great Disney films and about some of the really terrible story ideas that they had in some of them, and yet the films were very successful. So it's, there is no perfection. You're just trying to understand why things work the way they do and start learning to apply that. And if you decide you want to be a writer, start writing stories. And if you want to be a filmmaker, make films, because you only learn this by doing. You can go to school, yes. You can read books, yes. You can look at other films. These are all very important things to do. But until you sit down and start doing it yourself, you'll never really fully grasp all the complexity of what goes on. And that's perhaps why telling a good 3-act story is so hard. It's way more than just the story itself that you have to tell. It's how you execute it in terms of a film.
So many cogs and wheels in the machine.
And short films are a wonderful way, as we learned, short films, and still today Pixar embraces making short films because they really force you to tell a story very economically and to set things up very quickly and get to your result when you can. When we were making television commercials, we felt the same way. Most of our commercials were stories that we were telling, and we had to tell them in 30 seconds. And it was a great challenge, and we really improved our ability. We improved two things, and we did this purposely because we wanted to make that feature film. We did television commercials. Well, first of all, it paid our salaries, but secondly, it forced us to tell good stories in a very short time. And thirdly, it forced us to work collaboratively with people who were purchasing this service from us, so to speak, advertising agencies, and learning how the skills required to communicate your idea, convince people that it's a good idea, listen to them very actively, incorporate their ideas into what you do, and react to it. And with the exception of being led astray a little bit by Disney at the beginning of Toy Story, that's very much the skill that we applied.
One final question. 3-act structure and short films. Did you guys experiment with that combination?
Oh yeah, I mean, short films have 3-act structure. It's just there's not a lot of time to go from one act to the other. But if you look at Tin Toy, if you look at the short films we made back in the day, or the short films that are being made today at Pixar, you'll see 3-act structure. It's all there.
Yeah. Ralph, thank you so much for your time. Let's do this sometime again. Hopefully, when
Akash, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, it's not too much of a rush. But thank you so much again, and till next time. This is
very good. Thank you very much.